Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Statewide Broadband Programs and Funding Opportunities. I'm going to share my screen with you all and run over just a few housekeeping items. I'd like to cover just a few items, like I mentioned before we get started. Here we have a screenshot of the GoToWebinar control panel. You should see something like this on your own screen, likely in the upper right-hand corner. All attendees have joined in listen-only mode, so you will be on mute for the duration of today's webinar. However, throughout the webinar, you will have the opportunity to submit questions or comments by using the question pane of the control panel. You should see it there in one of those gray sections where you can pop it out below. We may not be able to address every question due to time constraints, but we will do our best to answer as many as possible. You will be able to see chat messages from us as well in the chat window on the GoToWebinar control panel. If you do click away from the meeting and have trouble locating it, look for a blue or orange flower icon or look at your browser window. The orange arrow on the control panel will collapse and expand the control panel if you'd like to get it out of your line of sight. Today's webinar, like all other ARC webinars, will be recorded on the GoToWebinar platform. This recording will be made available on our website, and I will add that link to the chat for your reference in just a moment. I'd now like to pass it over to my colleague, Carrie Stevens. Carrie is a director at the Atlanta Regional Commission focused on economic development and manages the comprehensive economic development strategy for the agency. She has a master's degree from the Savannah College of Art and Design and has worked in local government and consulting for over 20 years, successfully promoting thoughtful planning and implementation. We're very excited to have her facilitate this conversation today. Carrie, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and thank you everyone for joining the webinar. I know everyone's very busy with your programs, projects, and initiatives, and hope you're having some great summer fun. Through our work here at the Atlanta Regional Commission with comprehensive plans, and as Olivia mentioned, the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, or our CEDS, in our recent work, reliable access to broadband has become a priority, not only for our region, but also for our state and for the country. It's no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. It's a necessity for access to services, access to resources, access to education and employment, and to ensure that our small, medium, and large companies remain competitive, both in our state and internationally. During the pandemic and beyond, broadband has been a lifeline for some, but has also been a barrier for others. And for this reason, the Department of Community Affairs, the Georgia Municipal Association, the Georgia Technology Authority, and the Atlanta Regional Commission has partnered together to outline programs and funding available in our state. There are some amazing programs and unprecedented funding that our partners will be highlighting today. Our first presenter and partner will be Amy Stone, the broadband consultant with the Department of Community Affairs. Amy is a professional working in the field of planning and economic development based in Northeast Georgia. She graduated with a degree in landscape architecture from the University of Georgia and has experience in city planning, real estate development, project management in both the public and private sectors. Our second presenter and partner is Jessica Simons with the Georgia Technology Authority. Jessica serves as the Deputy CIO for Broadband and Special Projects at the GTA. Prior to joining GTA in 2001, she served as the Deputy Commissioner at the Georgia Department of Revenue, where she oversaw the Legal Affairs and Tax Policy Division, the department's Law Enforcement Divisions, and the department's Communication and Legislative Programs. She began her career in public service in the Georgia Secretary of State's office. Our next partner and presenter is Becky Taylor, and she's the Director of Federal Relations and Research with the Georgia Municipal Association. Prior to coming to GMA over 20 years ago, Becky served as the county planner in a South Georgia county and did consulting work with local governments across our state. Originally from Mississippi, she received her undergraduate degree in political science from Mississippi State University and moved to Georgia to get her graduate degree in public administration at UGA. Becky lives in Athens with her husband, teenage son, and hound dog. And our last presenter will be ARC's John Bayalis. John Bayalis has nearly 20 years of experience in public affairs management, grassroots mobilization, issue advocacy, lobbying, and government relations. John is currently the Intergovernmental Affairs Manager for the Atlanta Regional Commission, where he directs the agency's public policy across state and federal government. Prior to his time at ARC, John served as MARTA's Director of Government Affairs from 2014 to 2018, where he managed legislative wins, including the 2016 $2.5 billion sales tax referendum bill for MARTA's first transit expansion in over 20 years. John also currently serves on the board of the Fulton Technology and Energy Authority as ARC's designee. John graduated with a bachelor's degree in communication in 1996 from Widener University and a master's degree in communication from the University of Delaware in 2002. John currently lives in Grant Park with his wife, Elizabeth, and their 2 daughters. I'm really excited to hear from each of our presenters today. I will now turn it over to Amy with DCA to discuss their programs.
Good morning. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Are y'all able to see it, Carrie? Great. Okay. Well, good morning. Thank you everyone so much for being here, for taking the time to be here. I'm not able to see my screen. Hold on. There we go. I'm Amy Stone. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Carrie. I'm a consultant with the Georgia Department of Community Affairs in their broadband office. I'm really excited to be here to talk about the Department of Community Affairs 2 designation programs, the Broadband Ready Communities Program and the Broadband Ready Sites Program. Great, okay. So my objectives today in this presentation are to talk through these 3 areas. I want to get you familiar with the background and the benefits of Broadband Ready, go over the program requirements for the 2 programs, and then let you know how to get designated. So a little background on these 2 programs. They came out of the ACE Act, the Achieving Connectivity Everywhere Act, which passed the Georgia legislature in 2018. That feels like a long time ago in broadband terms. A lot has changed in terms of the funding landscape, but also the needs going through the pandemic, just how much it highlighted everyone's need for accessibility. That legislation in 2018 created a broadband department within DCA. It created the State Broadband Mapping Program, which hopefully some of y'all are familiar with. And Jessica Simmons is going to talk more about that during her presentation. And then it also created the groundwork for an eventual state grant program, which has been dramatically superseded by the federal monies that have come through for broadband post-pandemic. And again, Jessica will talk more about that. So I'm going to talk to you today about the 2 Broadband Ready programs that DCA offers. And those are, again, the Communities and the Sites program. So we'll start with Community. It's our most popular program. And if you are familiar with some of DCA's other designation programs like Camera Ready or Plan First, it's not dissimilar. It's a designation program that recognizes communities that have taken action. So implementing policies, procedures, and those actions underscore promotion of expansion of broadband access. So we'll talk a little bit more about what those actions are and what they can be. So the benefits of this program for your community is that it demonstrates to grant makers and providers that you're ready, that you've taken steps to remove obstacles to broadband infrastructure, and it also shows that you're thinking about the future. You're promoting community planning around broadband. So the second program is quite different from the communities program. It's a broadband ready site program, and that's a designation program recognizing sites that already have excellent internet. So it would be a facility or a grouping of facilities or development that has a broadband service at a rate of not less than a gigabyte per second. Those would be the sites or developments that are eligible for broadband ready site designation. So the benefits of this is it's an economic development tool. It's a way to show to project managers and site selectors that you're really serious about recruitment. So if you are doing a grad site, you might already be certifying your potential gig internet speeds. So this is something that you could do in addition. So by the numbers, right now we have 59 designated communities. I actually had to update it this morning. We designated 2 additional communities yesterday. 21 of those are cities and 38 are counties. And you can see the spread there on that little map on the left side of your screen. So 36 of our 38 designated counties have received funding through the recent federal grant programs. So it's a good way to show that your community is ready to go when providers are applying for these grants. So the requirements for broadband ready communities are a broadband element in your community's comprehensive plan. And anyone who's done their comprehensive plan lately knows that the broadband element is required and has been required since 2018. And it also requires a locally adopted ordinance that streamlines your permitting process, and then a completion of a really easy online application. And we'll talk a little bit more about the ordinance in just a minute. The requirements for broadband ready sites, it's a joint program between the Department of Community Affairs and the Georgia Department of Economic Development. So you would need to fill out a form showing your intent to apply, and then it would require a certification that the site has access to 1 gig download speeds. And so that's something that would be in partnership with the provider who is providing to that site. And then again, a completion of a very straightforward online application. A little bit more about the comprehensive plan. I'm assuming most communities on here are familiar with their comprehensive plan, but it's so important as a planner. I feel like it's so important to be thinking about our communities 20, 30 years in the future, because we're really planning for our next generation. And so presenting that vision for what internet access is going to look like. And so the broadband element is, again, that word action plan for the promotion of broadband services. And it needs to describe the steps for how a community is going to promote broadband access. It can include things like assessments, studies, ordinances, or goals. And a great goal, and one that a lot of communities have been putting in their broadband plan or their broadband element, is to achieve broadband ready community or site status. And if you haven't looked already on the statewide mapping tool, it's also a great source of information for what areas within your community are served and unserved, and what grant programs are in process for your community. And so those are great resources as well for your broadband element maps that you can include. The next step is to the passage of a local ordinance. One of the most important pieces that the legislation put in place for that local ordinance was establishing a single point of contact for all projects, for all permits related to broadband. And so that really helps the providers and when they're dealing with the community, of knowing who to talk to and who's going to help orchestrate if there's coordination between various permitting departments in your community. And then we keep a record of that single point of contact, and that's something that we would share if a provider is looking for that information. We also ask that it's presented on a website and easy to find. Another part of that ordinance is the codification of a timeline so that providers know what they're getting into. And it's generally a 10-day review period for application completeness, notification of incomplete applications, and then subsequent review cycles. It also puts a limit on the fees associated with a broadband project. And in our model ordinance, that's $100. However, communities can create their own ordinances so long as that it meets the spirit of the legislation, or they can adopt the model ordinance, which is what we've seen the most often. We do ask that communities recertify each year, and that's to make sure that we're remaining in compliance. The local ordinance hasn't been repealed. We haven't made significant changes to the broadband element of the comprehensive plan, but most importantly, to make sure that we have up-to-date contact information for that single point of contact. And we do send out notifications, lots and lots of reminders about that due date. However, because it's written into the legislation, if a community does not recertify annually, they can lose their certification. We hate to do that. So the application process is really easy. I can share this out afterwards, but there is a link on DCA's website to apply. It's an online form where you can upload a copy of your ordinance and upload a copy of your broadband element of your comprehensive plan. And in the case of a site, you'll fill out your intent to apply, and then we'll put you into contact with GDEC to further review that. If you do submit a plan that includes an ordinance that your community has modified from the model ordinance, then it'll go through a 30-day public comment period. We might have some questions for you about certain things. We might need to get more information from you, but there'll be a back and forth conversation about that. And then the designation. And along with designation, you will get, just like you do with Plan First or Camera Ready, you'll get the use of that logo on your website and press releases, a certification, and then if you'd like, we can come and visit your community and do a designation ceremony. And so that's all I have for you on those two programs. My contact information is here if you have any questions that you'd rather not share in the chat. But otherwise, I am here to answer any questions.
Give people a few minutes to put their questions in if they have any. I did have two questions for you, Amy. So do you have to be broadband ready community to receive grant funding?
You do not have to be broadband ready to receive grant program or grant funding, and Jessica might talk a little bit more about that, but it is a designation that checks some boxes. I think it depends on the various programs, but it shows community involvement, which is a consideration and when they are deciding on those grants.
And also, you had mentioned a single point of contact for your broadband ordinance. Who's the appropriate person to be that single point of contact?
The most common one that we see is the planning and development director, and I think that that's often because they're coordinating between various agencies within their communities. But we also sometimes see county managers and public works directors, because oftentimes the right-of-way is very important in the permitting process.
Amy, and just one last question. I don't see any questions in the chat or the question box. We may have some at the end. We'll probably reserve some time for that. I'm assuming the communities that have been designated are all currently on your website, so people could see who's been designated and where they are in the state.
Yes, they are. There's a drop down on our website that shows all those. The two that were designated yesterday probably aren't on there yet. Charlton and Thomas County, congratulations if either of y'all are here.
Well, great. Well, we'll reserve time for some questions. I actually do see one question here. So, I'm going to pull down the. Are there any opportunities for public or private partnerships?
Not necessarily through those two programs, but I think Jessica might have some insight on the public-private partnership. I'll pass that on to her, and if not, I'll fill in my thoughts on that, but I think she might touch on that.
So we'll reserve that till the end if we need to follow up with it. Are there any other questions? Those are all the questions I see for right now. So I think if Amy's able to pass that on to Jessica, we can start on the next presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Let's see, can you see my screen? You can, and let's see. And just to confirm that y'all can see the presentation now. Let's see. Sorry, I apologize. Y'all can see the presentation? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with y'all today. I'm excited to tell you about the work that we're doing at the State Broadband office, and really kind of, first of all, wanted to start off talking about kind of what that means in our structure. So some states have dedicated broadband offices. In Georgia, our office really kind of was collectively established in 2018 with the ACE Act that Amy mentioned, where there are some broadband responsibilities at the Department of Community Affairs, and then there are others at GTA, and the law really calls on us to work collaboratively on mapping efforts and kind of strategy efforts to extend broadband throughout our state. And so it's really through that partnership that we've been able to stand up these programs, and also with the partnership that we have with the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget to establish the grant programs that we'll speak about here in a moment. One of the biggest assets that Georgia has related to broadband, though, is our mapping effort. And so with our mapping effort, that was established in 2018 also by the enabling legislation. And then at that point, Georgia has done annual refreshes of that map to continue to show the improvement of broadband expansion throughout our state. So what you're looking at here is the kind of orange shaded areas on the map, or those are what we determine as served census blocks. And what that means is that 80% of the individual locations within that particular census block are served at the 25/3 threshold. If you see an area where it's light yellow, that's an unserved census block at that same threshold. The blue represents some areas with late provider data, but that does show that there's service in those particular areas too. We will be refreshing our map next week. It is something that every year the map is refreshed in July to show obviously new data and progress that's been made with the various programs and with the private capital that providers have been also injecting into the state as well. What you're looking at on the right-hand side here is even though we do look at our shading from a census block level, ultimately we run our programs and the grants that the state has done already, in addition to one of the really large grant programs we're about to talk about in a moment, we've really done all of those at the location level. And so you can see the red dots represent homes and businesses that are unserved locations based on our state mapping effort. And so the reason why I want to show you this, and we'll talk about it a little bit more talking about our future programs, is that while we are concerned about unserved areas as well, we're really looking at this down at the most granular level, looking at the location level. So even you can see in the dark orange area where it is a served census block, we still are tracking with our data locations within served census blocks that are unserved, because we have to get service to those locations too. So with that, Governor Kemp in 2022, 2022 is a big grant year for Georgia. And so with our office providing technical assistance, the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget is administering all of the grants that we're about to speak of. But Governor Kemp announced over $400 million in State Fiscal Recovery Fund awards, which were within ARPA, or the American Rescue Plan Act dollars, on February 1st of last year. And that's to serve over 175,000 locations, with the vast majority of those being unserved locations and then some being underserved. When we talk about unserved locations, it's a location that doesn't hit the 25/3 threshold, so 25 megabits in the download and 3 in the upload. State law does not perceive an underserved location, but the federal programs that we're working under do. And so that would be a location that doesn't meet the threshold of 100 megabits in the download and 20 in the upload. And so again, this program is covering over 175,000 locations in Georgia. When you look at the $400 million awards that Governor Kemp did, when you look at the matching funds associated with those projects, ultimately that program is injecting almost $730 million into broadband expansion once you look at the totality of that grant program. And another important part about this is any of the grants funded with these dollars have to be done by the end of 2026. Some of the early projects that were funded with this particular set of resources, some of the early projects are actually either finished or starting to finish, so we're seeing good progress. But they ultimately do have until the end of 2026, also depending on the timeline that they submitted to the state for review for the program. In addition to State Fiscal Recovery Fund, there was another subset of funds for connectivity within the American Rescue Plan Act called the Capital Projects Fund. It's very similar. The only difference is that the state had to submit a plan to U.S. Treasury for approval. We got our approval late last year, and so Governor Kemp earlier in January of this year announced $234 million in grants on January 4th. And we also had to do a small second round of awards to try to get most of our funding obligated, and with another almost $15 million award being announced in June. That's to cover over 77,000 unserved locations, and that program has a total investment of about $480 million when you look at the federal dollars associated and the associated matching funds to go along with that. And those projects are on the same timeline of that 2026 date. Starting to get a lot of colors on the map here, but this is, I think, one of the most important slides that I want to discuss today. Looking back at that initial slide that I showed of our state broadband map, it looks like we have a lot of unserved area to cover in Georgia, and we do. When I started my job 2 years ago, we had roughly about 450,000 unserved locations in Georgia. At this point, we're roughly, we're getting our final numbers with our map refresh, but we expect we're roughly around 100,000 unserved, unfunded locations in Georgia at this point. And so that's highlighted by the map on the left that you see, where it's the same map that you were looking at before with the orange shaded served census blocks. And you can see, again, our unserved census blocks. But what's really interesting is where you start looking at the green areas. So the light green area is the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which was a grant program that they essentially awarded a couple of years ago that's still underway. The dark green areas are the locations where the state and Governor Kemp allocated state fiscal recovery funds. And then on the right-hand side on the map, you can see in the blue areas where Capital Projects Fund grant awards were made. The Capital Projects Fund grant was done a little bit differently. For State Fiscal Recovery Fund, the entire state was eligible for broadband grants, and providers submitted their best applications for review. And at that point, after the committee scored the applications, the governor made final awards. For Capital Projects Fund, that was done a little bit more targeted, where using the data within the state broadband map, we identified, based on our data, the counties that were the most unserved counties in Georgia, and then drew the project areas and then opened applications for those particular areas. And then based on the 31 ultimately eligible project areas in the end, all 31 of those did get a funding allocation. And so with that, what you can generally see, and I've got it on our next slide, is that the areas where you see kind of the still kind of tan color, the lightly shaded yellow, the blue really kind of overlays over that to show that we're really strategically filling in the gaps where our areas are the most unserved. So, and this is the map that also shows those awards as well. And so while I think one of the things I think is really important about this as we talk about our future programs is, this map is an incredible resource. It's publicly available on DCA's website. If you also go to GTA's broadband website, we link over to them as well. So it's easy to find. But often we find when we're talking to communities, as they're looking to try to do, more localized level broadband plans, a lot of times they're not as familiar with the funding that has already been applied to certain areas. Generally, people are a little bit more aware if they've gotten a State Fiscal Recovery Fund or Capital Projects Fund award, but there are other grants out there, either through USDA's Reconnect grants, or again, FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund program. And it's something that obviously we don't want to apply duplicative funding. And so making sure that everybody's aware of all of those previous programs, and while a location might be currently unserved, there might be a funding commitment already to get there. And so those funding commitments are very important to understand as you look to develop your plans, as we look towards future programs I'll discuss in a minute, just because for example, for one of our future programs that we're rolling out, the federal government's made it very clear that they, in their notice of funding opportunity, that they are not going to fund over any location that already has rural digital opportunity funding there. And there's ways that we can work through that. And if you've got an RDOF award in your area and it doesn't appear that that provider is building yet, I would ask for you to contact us directly, and we can kind of talk through that, and we can reach out to that provider. But it's really just incredibly important to make sure that communities really understand where kind of the areas of most needs still are. And this is a great resource with lots of available data and lots of different layers that you can manipulate. And again, it's just a great resource to make sure we're strategically applying funding to the areas that need it the most. So with that, talking about our next program. So State Fiscal Recovery Fund, the governor has obligated all of the funding for broadband that was set aside. And then for Capital Projects Fund, all of the $260 million that the state is receiving on that has been obligated, except for about $5 million. And we're looking to stand up a device program with that. There is actually a current program through the Georgia Public Library System where they're distributing Chromebooks and hotspots to their various local libraries. And so we're going to work with them to use that money to bolster that program. So that being said, of all of the current federal funding that the state has access to is obligated. That being said, many of you might have seen the announcement a couple of weeks ago for the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. We call it the BEAD program. That's another set of resources for connectivity within the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA. And so ultimately what that was is it's $42.5 billion to fund broadband expansion for all of the states and territories. And so we found out a couple weeks ago that Georgia's allotment of that is just over $1.3 billion. which is an incredible number, thinking the fact that, Governor Kemp has already awarded $600 million, and you saw the funding allocations through the different shading in the map, and that, we have an additional $1.3 billion to now allocate to get to the remaining unserved locations in the state, and hopefully upgrade a lot of our underserved locations too. Of that $1.3 billion, the state has already received just shy of $5 million in planning funds, where we do have a lot of federal deliverables for this program. And so, and I'll talk about those a little bit more in just a moment, but we're actively working on all of our planning right now. The timeline of what generally the BEAD program is going to look like is we got approved for our funding in November of last year. And then based on that, we have 270 days to submit a 5-year action plan, which is essentially kind of an executive summary of kind of the state of broadband in Georgia. So that is due in August. We're actively working on that, and that should be posted on GTA's website in the next couple of weeks here for your review. In addition to that, the funding allocation announcement triggered a 180-day deadline for us of submitting our initial proposal to NTIA, which is a subset of the Department of Commerce that's overseeing this program. In that initial proposal, essentially, it's our plan of how we're going to use this funding to get to the remaining unserved and underserved locations throughout the state. Essentially, they're calling it the initial proposal, but essentially it's going to be the structure of our grant program. And so we're actively working on that as well. That's due by the end of the year. And also with this, there was also some funding for middle mile infrastructure. And so Georgia's pleased that 2 companies did receive funding through this program that was recently announced. Dovetail Communications is going to be receiving over $12 million. And they're located in West Georgia. And then also Zayo Group is receiving almost $14 million for a multi-state project, which includes middle mile infrastructure in 6 counties in Georgia. Another really large component about the work that we're doing and within the IIJA was also the Digital Equity Act, which provides almost $3 billion to establish programs for digital equity and inclusion. The state has received just over $1.4 million in digital equity planning funds. And with that, our deliverable to NTIA is that within a year of our November approval, we have to submit our state digital equity plan. And so our team has really actively been working to travel the state, do a great deal of stakeholder engagement. I actually just jumped off of our Digital Connectivity Advisory Board to join y'all today. So it really is a very active working group. The team earlier this year did over 20 in-person listening sessions with having 159 counties in Georgia and having to develop a state digital equity plan and a kind of synopsis of broadband in Georgia. We decided to take a regional commission approach. That way we could make sure that we hit each corner of the state. And obviously we added in more stops as well, and continue to add more as we're asked by communities to come out and speak to their various groups. But this stakeholder engagement has been incredibly important to help our planning efforts and make sure that, as we design programs for both our infrastructure programs coming up, but then also our digital equity programs, that we're really getting community feedback. As Amy mentioned, stakeholder engagement, community feedback, you're really getting local involvement in these programs is incredibly important to make sure that we get these programs right, but they're also part of our federal rules as well to prove to the federal government that we're also doing all this engagement as well. And so the Broadband Ready program is a fantastic program to participate in to show that your community is ready, that they're going to remove obstacles, and that you'll be a good partner with providers, again, with that single point of contact. But with the BEAD program, it is was essentially Congress's goal with this funding that we're going to get to all of the remaining unserved locations in Georgia. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that, for our mapping efforts, but then also the new FCC map, which I'll speak about in just a moment, it's really important that we map everything down to a location level, because again, at this point, even if your community is completely served, if there's one unserved location, within that area, we need to figure out with this program how to address that and what type of technology to address that with. And so with that, I will briefly touch on the FCC's new map. The FCC, as part of all of this and to prepare for these programs, the FCC's had a broadband map for a long time, but they looked at it based on a census block level, and if one location within the census block was served, they deemed the entire census block served. That's why Georgia, frankly, created our map a number of years ago, just because we knew that there were locations out there that were being missed by that approach. And so, we're very pleased that the FCC is now, as part of all of this, stood up a location level map, and the accuracy of that map continues to dramatically improve, the more iterations of the underlying address data that they get, but then also working with providers to get the information about the locations that they do serve. So ultimately, I say all of this to say what is the best thing that you could be doing right now to be prepared for the BEAD program and applying for a future grant. Ultimately, you're going to need to think about how you would like to structure a program. We generally found that it's easier if the state contracts directly with the internet service providers. Ultimately, they're often the ones that have a lot of the data. However, with the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, we also did have a lot of setups where a county would be the awardee, and then they would bring on an ISP as a sub-grantee. And so we certainly can talk a little bit more about that structure if y'all have any questions on that. But one of the things that, again, that I mentioned before, but I think is really critical, is start with the data. Often we talk to communities that talk about that they think they need to create really elaborate broadband plans in preparation for grant funding or to figure out how they're going to address this issue. And they're not aware that there's already actually a lot of federal funding that has been obligated for their particular community. And so obviously that could really influence their need for a plan, or ultimately shape the plan very differently than how it would be just based on what they think their current state of service is if they don't factor in the funding that's been obligated. One thing that's also really incredibly important is the BEAD program is being run based on the data within the FCC map. And so it's really important for everybody to go to the FCC's map and check do spot checking, check your address, check businesses in your community. First of all, make sure the address shows up. There's a way to challenge, they call it the fabric, but essentially it's the underlying address file. So if an address is not showing up, that needs to be challenged, because especially if that's an unserved location, first of all, we need to get on the same page with the FCC that an address exists there, that there is a home or business there. And then once we can do that, then that can be layered in with their data collections with the providers so that we can truly find out if that's a served location or not. The other thing you can do too there is you can also challenge the availability of service. There might be a provider that says that they're serving your location and that's not the case, or maybe they're not meeting the speed threshold that they're telling the FCC, but when you're seeing that service on the ground, that's really not meeting the standards that they're reporting it to the FCC. And so that's really important to go on the FCC's website, do spot checking in your various communities, and you'll be able to see at the same level that you can on the Georgia map, down to the location level of kind of a dot on a rooftop and the associated provider data for those particular locations. Again, it's really important to continue to challenge the accuracy of that map, just because ultimately at the time that we go through our state challenge process that I'll discuss really briefly, is that ultimately the outcome of that process is going to be the specific locations that are eligible for grant funding. And so this is something where everybody needs to be taking a very proactive approach of right now, if your address is not showing up, or if your address is showing as served and you don't believe that to be true, now is the time to currently challenge it with the FCC. But then before we stand up our grant program, the state is also going to be running a challenge process where local governments, communities, citizens, internet service providers can challenge if locations are missing, or also if they disagree with the availability of service that's being reported for that area. So ultimately, I think it's really important to look at the data, look at our map, look at the FCC's map, because ultimately that's going to determine the locations that are eligible for funding in your area. So I would encourage everybody to be proactive about that, just because that's going to help us get the locations within your area best served. And again, if there's one unserved location within a county, we have to address it with this program. So this is not just a rural issue. This is not just, oh, well, this county's really unserved, so all the money is going to be going there. This is truly a statewide program. Also, other things you can be kind of doing now and preparing for is, a lot of what Amy has talked about as part of the Broadband Ready community, but another big topic that we talk with our federal partners a lot about is permitting. Right now, with all of the grants Governor Kemp has done, the Public Service Commission can certainly tell that there's a lot of infrastructure projects going on right now, based on some of the calls that they are receiving. And so it's also something, just thinking about your permitting processes, the staff that you have or the communities have, and just being ready that if you're in a particularly unserved area, preparing that there's probably going to be a large infrastructure project at some point within the next few years. It's going to be funded in your community, and working to streamline that process just so that it's a quick process so that we can hopefully get people served as quickly as possible. Another thing is to talk again more about community engagement and kind of our digital equity and connectivity piece of things, where gathering feedback from your communities about access and affordability and other barriers, making sure that they know about the Affordable Connectivity Program through the FCC, which is a $30 a month subsidy, and many providers do offer low-cost options that are in many cases $30. So this is a program where, if people qualify, if they qualify for other benefits, they qualify for this program, where they essentially can receive free internet, or certainly at a very reduced cost, depending on what the providers in their area offer. And so, there's a lot of resources out there, and as we travel the state, it's something that we just, we try to let everybody that we possibly know about these resources, but we always would love help on that front. And just, there's a lot of resources out there. I think there's just certainly an educational component of making sure that everybody's aware of the resources that are there. So getting that feedback and kind of trying to understand what could be some barriers to access, I think are really important, just for the fact that, that is going to be information that we're going to be asking for as we roll out our grant program for the BEAD program. And the other thing that I would say that I would really encourage people to do is start having conversations with your internet service providers. I'll go back really quickly to the maps here. It's really important while I can't publicly share the data, now the FCC map is very clear of where current providers serve and their network footprints. Generally, it's going to be the easiest and probably cheapest project if a current internet service provider in your area just kind of edges out off of their current network, rather than a completely new provider coming in and building infrastructure in an area. And so the reason why I go back to this map is there's a particular internet service provider tied to every single one of these kind of green and blue grants. And so at that point, it also would be really helpful starting the conversations, certainly with anybody locally that's currently there. I would encourage you to talk to any internet service provider that's interested. But the other thing I would say is to point you in the direction of, I think it's important that, have the conversations also with the providers that, are not only already there, but the ones that are receiving this green funding on this map, just because they're going to be building in your community. And so chances are it's probably going to be easier for some of them to edge out on their current networks as we look at our future programs. And so that would be a really great place to start, of kind of talking with those particular providers that are already there or already receiving grant funding to be there, to talk about expansion for the future and the upcoming BEAD program. But with that, again, I think the major things to highlight are, start with the data. The state's got a great broadband map. Use the FCC map, check the accuracy there. The state is also doing kind of bulk challenges, but you know, there's only so much we can generally see at a high level versus, you know, much more granularly. You know, communities will be able to kind of better tell pockets where there's not service. And then that's, again, it's just going to be really important because it's going to determine what areas are ultimately eligible for BEAD funding or not. And then just thinking about the things that, you know, communities can be doing right now, preparing for large projects, again, meeting with the communities, getting feedback, really looking at that affordability piece and talking about the Affordable Connectivity Program and trying to find about other barriers, conversations with ISPs. And again, our timeline of generally expecting to have our grant plan into NTIA by the end of the year. And then we have to run a state challenge process that I believe is a minimum of 60 days. And then after that, obviously open up our grant process. So thinking kind of generally probably, you know, Q2 next year with an aggressive timeline of all the deliverables and federal approval that we need to get, you know, could potentially be the timing of when, you know, the at least first grant round for, you know, over $1 billion broadband expansion program would be opening. You know, we do expect that this is probably going to have to be granted out in multiple cycles. I don't think that there's a comprehensive way that we could get to everybody in just one cycle. That would be great if we could, but obviously we're going to have to see the quality of the applications that come in the first round and then figure out kind of how many more rounds we need following that. It is a federal requirement that once we get our grant plan approved, that we have to essentially create our final proposal, which essentially just means that we have to have all of our funding essentially obligated within 365 days. We have to submit a final plan for their approval, but we essentially have to say if this is how we are going to obligate the funding. These are the locations, these are the providers, these are the dollar amounts. And so it is something that, you know, each program has been very different. With ARPA money, it's certainly been more kind of relief money, and the guidance from the federal government has to move quickly and get it out. With this program, there are a lot more kind of checks and balances and deliverables along the way before we can get to grant programs. But you know, as you can see with the green funding on the map, there's been really significant work that's been done in the last couple of years. And, you know, we feel confident about the plans that we're putting together for the BEAD program to hopefully get to all of our remaining unserved and upgrade a lot of our underserved locations. So with that, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have and really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was a ton of great information and some great pointers on how people can utilize their time getting ready for the funding opportunities. Just that we had one question in the chat about the slides. We'll share all the slides as well as the recording for everyone on this webinar. It'll be posted on our website and I'm sure with our partners. We did have one. I'm going to go through the questions here in the chat, Jessica. What funding / grant opportunities are available for staffing, allowing for permitting and inspection, for the installation of new infrastructure on county right-of-way? Is that part of the program?
So that's currently something that we're looking at of all of the eligible uses of funding. Most of the requirements of the programs are generally that this has to be for kind of the actual last mile infrastructure. But we actually are working with NTIA to find out if it is an acceptable use of funding to try to bolster staff. One thing that obviously you mentioned permits, but one thing that we also see in talking with the Public Service Commission and 811 that we really do see as another component that we need to bolster are going to be locates. With all these big infrastructure projects, it's important to protect the infrastructure that's already there. And so we're also looking at that from a locate perspective. And so that's certainly something we can follow up on once we get a final answer and the guidance from the federal government if it's an acceptable use of the funding to use that to bolster local staff.
Jessica, we had one additional question. I know you kind of mentioned when you thought the BEAD money would be available, but they asked one more time, when would the BEAD money be available on the ground?
So on the ground, so every grant that OPB has done has been reimbursable. And there is a 25% matching requirement with this particular grant. There are some mechanisms where there's a waiver process, but essentially there's a 25% match. We have not done required matches with the other grants. This was actually in the law. But realistically, we are submitting our initial proposal by the end of the year. It all depends on how long it takes for us to get federal approval of that plan. Then after that, we run our state challenge process, which is at least 60 days. Then we have to grant out, over $1 billion to make sure that we get to all unserved locations. And that has to be done within 365 days of when we get the federal approval of our plan, which will probably be early next year. And then at that point, once we get approval of our final proposal, then at that point, we will have the ability to draw down our funding. But it is a situation where this will be a reimbursable grant. And so the timeline wise, I mean, the money, based on when the timelines that they've given within our kind of allocation announcements, and then how we see these programs working timeline wise, we think that the funding Georgia will be eligible to draw down our funding based on our timelines in probably early 2025. But then at that point, applicants or awardees would have to show reimbursable expenses to actually start receiving reimbursement on that.
Thanks, Jessica. And just as a follow-up, would this be similar to notice of funding availability that we've seen in the past with grants? Or will it be a different process?
It'll be very similar. We did a very comprehensive notice of funding opportunity for the Capital Projects Fund announcement. So as you can imagine, so I'm actually sitting here rereading it in preparation of the notice of funding opportunity is 98 pages. And that is essentially all of the rules and requirements that the state has to put into our programs, of how we run these programs. And so obviously we have found with the Capital Projects Fund grant, it makes our process much smoother to have a very clear notice of funding opportunity. And so we will have that as well. But as you can imagine, with 98 pages of federal requirements, we are trying to streamline that. But that will go out essentially once the notice of funding opportunity will go out once our initial proposal, so our grant plan, is approved. So I would expect the notice of funding opportunity to go out. Again, it all depends on federal approval and how long that takes, but early next year.
Great, Jessica. We do have another question in the chat. If you find an error in the service for your...
Sorry, I apologize. You're breaking up a little bit. Can you repeat that?
Area, how do you go about reporting it and getting it correct?
So it's for the state map.
Does it go through your office? I think the question is, and how do they go about doing that?
Well, so let me share my.
Oh, I think Jessica might.
I apologize. I've got three.
Oh, Jessica, I think we lost you for a second.
Can y'all hear me now? Okay. So if you think that your location is incorrect in the state map, please just email me. This is my contact information, and we'd be happy to take a look at that. The FCC actually on their website, it's a very easy process. As you're looking at an individual location, there's a little radio button that you can toggle down, and one of the options on there is challenge location, and then you just have to write a brief description about why you're challenging that location. And then that works through the FCC process. And then at that point, they work with the providers to kind of quality check that challenge. And so it's very easy on the FCC's website, and we want to make it as easy as possible for you on the state level of just send me an email, and that will start the process for us to be able to adjudicate that too.
We have one more question. Thank you, Jessica. Has utility locate resources been addressed for fiber infrastructure installation per GA dig law?
I apologize, you broke up a little bit there again. Let me see if I can see the question in chat.
Sorry about that. Yes,
So essentially,
has utility locate resources been addressed for fiber infrastructure installation?
I think that's similar to kind of the previous question where we are looking at the acceptable uses of the funding to find out if that's something that we can bolster with. We are actively talking to Georgia 811. We just actually added them to our Georgia Broadband Advisory Board to see if there's anything we can do there, because obviously, you know, they deal with tickets and they're working with third parties, and just trying to find ways that, you know, we can maybe, you know, work with them to try to, you know, help that process, just knowing the injection of this funding and the scale of these projects. You know, that's permitting and locates are definitely something that we are certainly looking at, that just because we know that the impact that that's going to have on communities.
Thanks, Jessica. We have one more question in the chat, and then we'll jump over to you, Becky. For the future of the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program, will it only be made available to nonprofits? When is this expected to come out?
Sure. So our state digital equity plan is due in November to NTIA, and then we have to get approval on that. Once we get approval on that, then we can roll out our state digital equity capacity grant. And then we're going to structure that program as just as we can to follow federal guidance. But we do believe that nonprofits and local governments can apply for that. But again, as we roll out our program, we'll also have a notice of funding opportunity for that. Timeline wise, I think that's going to be early next year based on the timeline of when we're going to submit our state digital equity plan. Then we do have to get federal approval of that plan. And then at that point, we're able to run our capacity grant. So I would think early next year on that.
We will reserve some time at the end for additional questions as they come up. I will thank you, Jessica. That was some great information, and thank you for answering all the questions. We'll let Becky jump in and talk about the upcoming summit.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Can everybody hear me okay on your end? Okay, I don't have any slides to present for everyone today, but there's a handout. If you'll look over in your GoToWebinar, the gray boxes over there, you'll see a handout that is a flyer for an upcoming event. GMA is planning to hold our 4th annual Statewide Broadband Summit on August 29th in Jackson, Georgia. It's an all-day program. There's no cost to attend. We provide lunch for all participants. And in the past, we have focused a lot on funding for infrastructure and, you know, letting local leaders know, local officials are the primary target audience for this event. And we're just trying to let them know, you know, what kind of partnerships you need to develop, how you can tap into any federal and state funding, and how you can participate in, say, DCA's programs. But this year's focus is really going to be more about digital equity, digital literacy. So we're going to devote a good bit of time to that. But we're also going to have a permitting discussion as part of our program. I won't go into the details about the whole agenda, but we will have a provider update. We're going to invite providers to tell us what they've been doing in the spaces of digital equity, workforce development, and things like that. So it's really just an all-day event where we really want to invite city and county and regional officials to take part. Come and listen to some of the information that that Jessica and others have to share. We could not have done this event in any year, but especially this year, without the great partnership that we have with the Georgia Broadband Office. Jessica and her team, Onisha over there, have been amazing to work with, and just to inform us about the kind of topics that we need to be getting the word out about. We feel like this is a really important time to engage in this conversation with local officials, because we really think that mayors and council members and county commissioners, this is a great role for them to play in this process. They know their communities, they know their residents and businesses, and they know their needs. So you have an exciting opportunity here to connect the folks in your community to these federal resources at this unprecedented time. So we encourage everybody to take a look at that flyer. You can sign up with the QR code on there. If you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My name and information are on that flyer as well. And I know that since Amy and Jessica have touched on a number of different projects that are available through the IIJA as well as the state of Georgia and the OPB. Take a look at GMA's website if you're a local official interested in tapping into federal and state funds. There's so much out there right now that it's really hard to get your arms around everything. So GMA has attempted to create a one-stop shop with our grants calendar and our grant programs listing, so you can see when things are going to be coming up in the next year or so, and you can begin planning for those things. Like for your permitting processes, you have time to take a look at how you're using those permitting processes. Are you using best practices? Are there changes that you can make to your operations in how you're doing permitting to expedite getting those funds out the door? You know, are you staffing up? Do you have the resources necessary to be able to make everything fall into place at the appropriate time? So we're very excited about this event on August 29th. Again, it will be from 10 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. Jackson, Georgia EMC, Central Georgia EMC. Hope you all can make it, and we look forward to seeing you in August. That's my update, Carrie. Any questions?
See any summit questions? I do have a few follow-up questions that we'll get to at the end of the presentation. Give ARC's John Bialis a bit to talk about some of.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to share this information, and we will look forward to seeing you guys in Jackson.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, excellent. For those of you that don't know me, John Bialis from the Atlanta Regional Commission. I'll keep my remarks relatively brief. Jessica mentioned the one program that I wanted to bring up. Here on ARC's end, we have been doing a deep dive on this idea, you know, the dichotomy between access, which is what we've heard a lot about today, and utilization, particularly for low-income households. And Jessica did mention the Affordable Connectivity Program, and I wanted to act as a level of redundancy for that. Obviously, the metro region and some of the other urbanized areas are a little bit more wired in than other parts of the state, and we're doing a great job in getting the entire state up to speed. Statewide, however, once access is established everywhere, including the urban areas, we still have a challenge in getting low-income households to find ISPs and affordable avenues with which to access the internet itself. So we are working with our jurisdictions and other stakeholders. We're working with our counterpart regional commissions across the state to really promote the Affordable Connectivity Program. It's an FCC program, as Jessica mentioned. Pumps $14.2 billion into the program to give affordability to low-income households that meet certain eligibility criteria. Within or below 200% of the federal poverty level, if you already participate in certain programs like Medicaid or SNAP, so on and so forth. We want to make sure people know about this. Jessica, correct me if I'm wrong, but at the latest review of the data I saw, the statewide uptake of this program is still only around 35% for all eligible households. We have varying levels within our 11 county regional commission region in terms of what's been utilized and what's not, but no one's at 100%. And because of the emphasis that I think we can all agree on with regard to accessing, broadband and accessing, the web, it's really about economic development, job creation, being able to have people have, access to telehealth, so on and so forth. So anything less than 100% for those low-income households to take part in this ACP program is, not desirable. So we're working hard until the funding runs out to make sure people know about it, working with chambers around the region. Again, working with our county and local stakeholders in the ARC footprint and beyond. I did want to also mention that there will come a time where the funding does run out. I think projections are right now the ACP is targeted to go dry completely around Q1 of 2024. So we will also be working on the back end, some of the things that I have a specialty in, and working with our congressional delegation to ensure that funding goes beyond the projected end time, again, around the beginning of 2024. So look for communication from ARC and other stakeholders on this as we continue to push through the end of the year to make sure people enroll in this program. And I'm happy to answer any questions about this program or anything else that I can help out with.
Thank you so much, John. We'll thank you again for all our presenters and all the great information that we've received today. I'm going to just generally open this up. I have at least one question in the chat that I will throw out, and I think this is about is to Amy, but correct me if I'm wrong, the person that has asked this question. If a county has already become a member, can a city within that county apply as well? And what might be the advantages / disadvantages? I'm assuming that's with the broadband ready and community programs.
The answer is absolutely. The city, we see that a lot of cities within the county that's designated, and the advantage would just be to further underscore their preparedness, because the local ordinance is going to regulate the permitting process within that municipality potentially. That would align them with the county's efforts. So I think it's a great way to show community preparedness.
Thank you so much. I'm looking through here. I had a quick question while I'm looking through these to make sure we've gotten all the questions. As far as the internet service providers, I know that you had mentioned speaking to ones that were already active in communities near you. Is there a list, if you don't know one, who the ISPs are, or if you want to look at different ISPs, is there a list, Jessica, that people could look at, either approved or ISPs that could work in particular areas?
And so there's not a specific list, but what I would encourage you to do is to look at the FCC's website, because they're able to publicly put out the most information. Service providers are historically pretty protective of their network coverage. However, it's publicly available now on the FCC's website. Our state law does not allow us to show it at the level that they do. And so that's really the best resource to find out who is currently in your community. And then the other thing is too, it's difficult to say that is there a list of somebody who could potentially provide service there, just because we are seeing through our grant programs that there are newer companies that might not have a footprint in Georgia right now, but that have applied for grant funding or that are looking to expand into the state. And so, while we could certainly help direct you to some of our current providers in Georgia, there is not a comprehensive list, just for the fact that there could always be, a new entrant into the state that might be looking to serve a particular area. But I would encourage you to take a look at the FCC map, because they're publicly able to share the most amount of data. I can kind of point you to, a handful of providers that might be in a particular county or might be in a particular area. But based on confidentiality of the network footprints that we've got based on our state law and our mapping effort, you're going to find out, in this particular case, you're going to find out a lot more information about who is currently there, who is nearby, based on the FCC's map.
Thank you, Jessica. And I did want to go back to the question that was asked about public-private partnerships. I know you mentioned a little bit about that, Jessica, in your presentation, but I wondered if you could expand on that just a little bit.
Absolutely. So, there's definitely opportunities for public-private partnerships. It's something that we have seen generally. Safe Risk Recovery Fund, most of the grants, as I mentioned, were through the county, and then working with an internet service provider is kind of a sub-grantee to them, or contractor. We have generally found for Capital Projects Fund, we did actually have it so that only internet service providers could apply. We did find that streamlined the process a little bit, just based on some federal procurement rules about asset ownership and who's going to actually own and maintain the network in the end. And so federal procurement is certainly something that is rather complex, and so that was really able to streamline processes a great deal. For BEAD, we have to make it so that anybody is eligible to apply. For capital projects fund, we also are funding a public-private partnership in South Georgia where the municipality is actually going to own the network, but then they're going to work with an internet service provider to light that. And so there's definitely opportunities. I will say, knowing how we run the previous grants, I think it is much easier of having the grant agreement and that relationship directly between the ISPs and the state. However, it's not to say that that's the only model. And also, even if our agreement, though, is directly with the internet service provider, we strongly are going to be requiring community support, community involvement, as a highly scored component of our applications. Broadband ready communities are also part of that, and that was a scored component also on our capital projects fund application of you got additional points if you're a broadband ready community. And so I could see us adding that in again to our application process to again really incentivize participating in that program as well. So there's lots of opportunities for partnerships. It's just a matter of kind of what that partnership might look like based on how we set up the GRANT program.
Thanks, Jessica. We have another question. There's a nonprofit that's on the call, and they recently launched a broadband project, and they asked specifically, they've been working on the project for 3 years. Is there a workshop for the nonprofit leaders working on these broadband projects?
So what I would say is I'm certainly happy to share my email address again. We generally have, constant one-on-one conversations with everybody that's working in the space in Georgia, along with kind of really broad stakeholder engagement. And so, our office would love to talk to anybody that's working in the state and find out what they're working on or ways that we can, walk everybody through the process. Ultimately, we are going to be designing a grant application and working on our plan of how we're going to score those. And so that's something that we do have to be careful of, kind of where the line is of how much assistance we can provide and where we can't, where it's related directly to the grant. But we'd love to have a conversation, hear about the project, and find any ways that we can support anybody that's working here in Georgia or wants to expand through the resources that our office has.
Jessica, and I had 2 last questions. I think I've gotten all the questions in the chat. You had mentioned the match. Can you go over the possible match or not a non-match, just for people that are on the call?
Sure. So within the IIJA, there is a 25% match requirement for the grants. There is a waiver process but that is going to be used, I think, in very limited circumstances. There is also a process where if something is deemed an extreme high cost location, that there's the possibility to waive the match requirement on that particular location. But ultimately, the policy decision of what the state is going to do related to those extreme high cost locations is still being determined. And so that will ultimately come out in our initial proposal. One other thing I do want to highlight is, so we are posting our 5-year action plan very shortly here, but so for our initial proposals and final proposals, we do have to post those for public comment. And so if there are any points within there that are of concern, I certainly would encourage anybody to highlight those within the public comment period, but some things are required based on the legislation, and then other things we're going to have to take a look at to ultimately determine how we're going to stand up our program. But so again, in the situation that something is an extreme high cost location, there is the possibility or this of how the state might implement the program, but otherwise it is in the legislation that there's a 25% matching requirement. Generally, I will say what we've seen is with State Fiscal Recovery Fund, we had almost a 50% match from the awarded projects. And then for Capital Projects Fund, where those were some of our most rural, most unserved areas, we ended up with about a 40% match. And so while we have not had a match requirement of our previous programs, just naturally, one program was almost 50% and one program was about 40%. So seeing how most of those applications ultimately played out, I don't think that we're going to have an issue for most of these areas with that match requirement based on the data that we've seen from our previous programs. We do have a few applications that have been funded that the match was below 25%, but thus far nothing has been funded if it did not include a match. And so, but that's certainly something that we're looking at as we design the next program, and it will be available for public comment as well.
Thanks, Jessica. And I have a question for Becky. It was just a clarification question. Are we able to attend the workshop on August 29th?
I'm not sure who asked the
generally,
question.
Becky, who's
Yeah.
able? Yeah.
The target audience is going to be city
I think
officials.
the question is who's able to attend?
Okay, it's going to be elected and appointed city and county officials, regional commissioners, for example, if you're an employee of a regional commission. We have sponsors on the program on the agenda, but those are also sponsoring this event. So the providers that are going to be in the room are going to be sponsors. If you're interested in taking part, please let me know if you are a provider and would like to be in the room that day.
We had one additional question. Can we have a list of attendees for networking and private partnerships? We do have a list. I'll verify that we're able to share that, and if we are, we certainly to the group. Look and see. I think that was our last question that I had on the list, and we're getting close to time. About that. Again, thank you all the presenters and our great partners for all the information that you've given all of us today. This has been a great resource. And as we've said, it has been recorded. We will send an email out following this webinar that will have both not only this recording, but we'll have everyone's presentations. And we will also send out any lists that we are able to provide. So again, I thank everybody for participating, our presenters, our partners, and everybody who has joined this webinar. I'm really excited to see what we can do statewide with all this funding that's coming so that we'll have a lot better access to broadband and for our communities, for our businesses, and for everyone in the state of Georgia. So again, thank you so much and hope everybody has a great summer. And also wanted to say from ARC, if you have any questions, certainly contact us. We're always happy to answer any questions or help out with initiatives. And I'm sure all of our partners here are willing to help as well. And we will also provide all of their contact information. So with that, I will close it out and say thanks so much and thank you for participating.